Hello and welcome to this episode of the Millis podcast, a show about ideas, books, and events from the Christian intellectual scene in Australia and beyond. I'm your host, Simon Kennedy, and I am the director of the Millis Institute and senior lecturer in the humanities at Christian Heritage College in Brisbane. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. And I'm joined today by Greg Sheridan AO, who is the foreign editor at The Australian. He's a respected newspaper, radio, and TV commentator. He's one of Australia's leading public intellectuals. His career in journalism has seen him corresponding from glamorous places like Beijing and Washington, and the most glamorous of all will be Canberra, of course, Greg. He's now based in Melbourne. He writes a regular opinion column for The Australian along with his editorial duties there. He's the author of a number of books, most recently being God is Good for You through Allen and Unwin. And his most recent book, which we're going to chat about today, is this one, Christians, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, also published through Allen and Unwin. It's a book that ranges over early Christianity, biblical criticism, apologetics, politics, cultural engagement. We meet Christians from places like China, Tanzania, United States, Singapore, Australia, and the United Kingdom. It's a fascinating book, and it's great to have Greg on to discuss it. Welcome to the Millis podcast, Greg. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Simon. It's really good to talk to you.
You've written this book, Christians, which we'll come to in a moment, and it's a book that could be summarised, at least to my mind, as a defence of Christianity, but also a witness to the way that Christians live and also impact their world. Before we get to the book, what's your own journey in relation to the Christian faith?
Well, Simon, I must say my journey is extremely undramatic and mundane, really. I was born into the Christian faith, and so I was born in 1956 at a time when, notionally at least, almost all Australians were at least nominally Christian. The faith was the centre of the life of my family, and I've always been a Christian believer. For about a week or so, I tried to see if I could look at atheism. Not really a week, really just for one day, and it kind of didn't work. And so I've never had any trouble at all with Christian belief. I have had, the great challenge in living up to an ethical Christian life, an enormous challenge there. But and I guess there are periods in my life when your faith is more intense, when you seem to be in a more intense relationship with Jesus than at other times. But it's kind of always been there for me, and I've had the practice of saying some prayers every day and so on for my whole life. So it hasn't really been a moment of revelation for me or anything like that. It's just always been part of my world.
It's very interesting and encouraging for someone like me who has a very similar boring story in relation to the Christian faith, growing up in a Christian home and so on. Christians is a book. As I was reading it, I was reflecting on the audience for the book, and it's a book that will encourage Christian believers, but also challenge non-believers, I think. What were you aiming to do in writing the book? What was the goal of the book?
Well, Simon, so 2 books ago, I wrote a memoir, When We Were Young and Foolish. I went to a whole lot of writers' festivals, was astonished that there was not a single book in favour of Christianity or in favour of the Jewish outlook on life. And I thought, how can that be, given that the Judeo-Christian tradition absolutely formed our civilization? Yeah. So I thought the culture had turned against Christianity, and to some extent was trying to bluff Christians out of their faith with 2 propositions, really. One is that belief in God is irrational, and the other is that the New Testament is a fantasy or all lies or something. So the last book, What is Good for You, addressed this question, belief in God. Somebody said to me, emerging from that book, not a bad defense of the idea of God, belief in God, but where is the living Jesus in that book? And I realized that was a very fair criticism, because I assert in that book as an intellectual proposition that the person of Jesus Christ is the absolute center of the Christian faith. So this book is in two halves, as you say. The first half is really a search for Jesus through reading the New Testament, mainly as a journalist, just reading it as a professional journalist, reading the books one book at a time for narrative, character, incident. And like a lot of Christians, I'd get different passages of the Gospels and think about them for their theological significance. But I hadn't really, in my life, I'm ashamed to say, read a book of the New Testament from start to finish,
right?
Just as if I were a normal reader.
Yeah.
And of course, so then I buttressed that reading with research. But reading it as a journalist is great fun. A lot of it is high class journalism, especially the Gospel of Luke. Yeah. He tells us at the start he's the Bob Woodward of the Jesus movement.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Everyone. He's read all the accounts. This is his journalistic method.
Yep.
And the other thing is, I wanted to demonstrate to modern readers that scholarship has not rendered the New Testament fantastical or unbelievable. In fact, scholarship has swung back to the idea that the New Testament is pretty much eyewitness history or the testimony of people who reported the eyewitnesses. Now, that you shouldn't believe in Christianity because scholarship swings that way. You shouldn't disbelieve in Christianity because scholarship swings some other way. But modern people who are inclined to dismiss the New Testament should be aware that you can now safely say from history, Jesus lived, he was crucified, the early Christians believed he was risen. You can establish all that from history, and everything that you can test in the New Testament against history turns out to be true. And the scholars now think that it was the eyewitness testimony or people reporting eyewitnesses. So I thought that was important to tell to modern readers. And then in the second half of the book, I wanted to look at what the modern friends of Jesus are like, how belief in Jesus shapes their lives, leads them to the choices that they make.
Yes. Yeah, that's helpful. And so it struck me reading it, Greg, that this is the kind of book I would give to my non-Christian friends to read. It's very accessible, but really interesting and approachable in a way that, a book that might have been written by a Christian theologian isn't. Did you think this would be thinking that this would be a good book for non-believers to read just as much as believers? Is that sort of what you were aiming for?
Yes, Simon, I'm thrilled that you react to the book in that way. So a few things governed the way I wrote the book. First of all, this is my 8th book. So I wanted to write this book the same way I write my other books, the same way I write my journalism. So there's no doubt I'm a believer. I make that position clear in the book. But it's not a book by a clergyman. I'm not remotely criticizing clergymen, but it's not a book. It's not an inside baseball kind of book. You don't have to know all the terminology. Journalism works best when it argues from first principles and it looks at the sources and it looks at the evidence. So I start with the presumption that the Gospels are true, but I read them just as a secular journalist. And then I write about them in the way that I'd write about anything else. So my whole life in journalism is about writing about complex subjects, military budgets, the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, the efficacy of the American electoral system, but trying to make it interesting, and if not interesting, at least intelligible to a normal lay person readership. So you don't use jargon. You try to argue from first principles. If you can put in a little bit of humor, that's good. Sometimes you write a little bit about yourself, not exactly about yourself, but how you react to a story. So that helps people understand. So this story produces this reaction, that sort of thing. So all the things I've done in 42 years of journalism, I'm trying to do in this book, but with the added advantage that I've actually at last stumbled upon the best story. So it took me 42 years, but I got there in the end.
No, very good. I mean, what you say in the preface that the book investigates Christians rather than Jesus himself, hence the title. And so you say that readers will meet Jesus, as you've already alluded, Jesus will meet Jesus' first friends, and then we'll meet some of his contemporary friends, Christians today. But Richard Glover's, there's a comment on the cover of the book, which is also inside the cover. Richard Glover says that Jesus jumps off the pages of the book. Why do you think Jesus jumps off the pages of a book that's actually about Jesus' friends? What's the dynamic there, do you think?
Well, it's extraordinarily good of Richard Glover to say that. So Richard is a very distinguished, famous ABC broadcaster and author. Wrote a beautiful memoir himself called Flesh Wounds. And with my last book, he said, I had one complaint to the ABC. I thought his interview, the questions were so much cleverer than the answers. But and he said, I nearly had him at one point. His wife got a bit worried at the point where I was arguing about how unlikely life is, especially human life. And the best explanation is God. Yeah. But he remains a conscientious atheist. But right. I'm thrilled that he had that reaction. Pastor Russell Evans from the Pentecostal Planet Shakers had a similar reaction. So there is a chapter. The first chapter is about the crucifixion, which I think is the most radical claim of Christianity, that God can die. That even more radical than the resurrection.
Yeah, indeed.
And then the rest of the first half of the book is about the New Testament. So I'm then looking at Jesus through the experience of his first friends. The Gospel of John, also the experience of Mary, and then a chapter about the historical figure of Paul. So Paul wasn't with Jesus on his earthly ministry, but Paul stands in the position of modern Christians.
Yeah.
He has a relationship to Jesus which is spiritual, as it were, but nonetheless extremely intense. But the first half of the book, although it's about Jesus' first friends, except for the chapter on the crucifixion, the friends are investigated in the light of their friendship with Jesus. And I'm thrilled that some people felt the personality of Jesus came through. I mean, that's more than I could have ever hoped for or imagined. It's absolutely no credit to me, but it is a credit to the tremendous power of the gospel. If you actually go back to the gospel in a translation that is even remotely decent, and actually, as I say, read it book by book, it's incredibly powerful, and of course full of humanity. All these little intricacies and idiosyncrasies of the first disciples, and which again to me testifies to its authenticity. Because if you were making it up 300 years later, you wouldn't put all that, Paul losing his temper and all this sort of stuff.
That's right. And this is just a quick comment, but one of when you mentioned Paul before, the chapter on Paul, you call him Christ's Lenin, which is quite a provocative way of putting it. I was quite struck by that chapter title and the chapter itself. Paul was the Lenin of the early church, you've said on page 148, which I'm sure will make a few people's eyebrows raise. But it makes sense, right? Because he was such a provocative and human enthusiast kind of person. He was passionate about Jesus and made sure everyone knew about it. So I thought it was very good. I like the way that you shaped the first half of the book, not just talking about Jesus, but about those who knew him. After the first part of the book, which you've kind of just outlined, there's a very interesting chapter on Christian engagement in culture and the arts. And I was especially taken by your account of the way that Christian themes have been presented in great novelists, contemporary novelists like Marilyn Robinson, but those like Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, who I've been reading quite a bit of recently. What do you think what's the utility in Christians engaging in things like literature and art in terms of engaging
that's in a sense, that's almost my favorite chapter in the book. But just before answering that, I just want to, if with your indulgence, say one sentence about the comparison of calling Paul Christ's Lenin.
Of course.
This actually has upset a few of my friends. Let me hasten to say, as I point out in the book, there's no moral comparison between Paul and Lenin.
That's right.
Lenin was a murderous communist tyrant who hated humanity and didn't even like to listen to Beethoven because it made him feel sentimental about human beings. So in personality and moral character, Paul, who is an apostle of love, could not be less like Lenin.
Yes.
But the specific comparison I was making was this. Lenin was both the theorist of communism and the practitioner who transformed it into a powerful movement and brought it to power in the Soviet Union. Paul, similarly, was a profound theorist, if you like, of the Jesus movement. I mean, he understood the theology of Jesus and his personality, but he was also an organizational genius who spread the church in the early world, whose universalism, there is neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, etc., completely revolutionized the ancient world, tore its mind out, and really turned Christianity into an immensely popular movement. So it's only in that way that I'm making that comparison. But I'm glad it struck you. It shows, and a journalist can't resist a good headline.
No, it was. I thought it was very much a newspaper headline style. It's very attention grabbing, but it makes perfect sense what you're saying. There's an analogy between the way that the men operated, rather than not the morals, but certainly what they achieved was extraordinary.
And the combination of the theory and the practice.
That's
that
right.
Was the thing.
That's right.
But to answer your question about the chapter on culture, so one of the ways the culture is turned against Christianity is that Christianity no longer appears in the culture. If you look back at the Academy Award-winning movies of the 30s through to the 60s, a huge number of them were Christian-themed movies. How Green Was My Valley with the great, nonconformist Protestant clergyman, Mr. Grufford. The Sound of Music, the Von Trapps escaping from Austria, escaping from the Nazis. And lots of movies in between. Spencer Tracy and Gregory Peck playing great tough guy priests, salt of the earth. The Bishop's Wife, Cary Grant playing an angel. It's a Beautiful Life, another film based on an angel. And now in a movie, you almost never see Christianity, and you never see, and when you do see Christianity, most of the time it's in a negative spirit. So the clergyman is either an adulterer, a murderer, a child abuser, a force for reaction, an opponent of women's empowerment and so on, or they're just kooks, they're at the best, they're sort of harmless stuffers. And this is certainly the case in literature too. The great literature of the 20th century was essentially Christian literature. Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh. When Thomas Merton wrote his book, The Seven-Sided Mountain, about becoming a monk, it sold 3 million copies in the 1950s. Whereas popular books today, that's not so. Although, as I say, Marilyn Robinson is a great exception, this wonderful Christian novel, Gilead. But why should Christians engage in the arts? Why should the arts pay attention to Christ? First of all, the proper purpose of the arts is the pursuit of truth and beauty. And at the heart of truth and beauty is Jesus Christ. Also, the proper purpose of the novel is to examine the deepest truths of the human heart. And at the center of every human being is God, even if they're not aware that at the center of them is God. So for art to do its job properly, it's going to be dealing with God. The other thing is, you cannot accurately portray humanity if you leave out the religious dimension. So I cite a TV series, Jane the Virgin. Terrible title. You hear this title, you think it's going to be a raucous, blasphemous mistreatment of Christian morality. In fact, it's a crazy American sitcom, but it's quite a beautiful series which celebrates the Christian faith of the Hispanic heroine, Jane, and who decides to remain a virgin until she's married. And she does this out of religious conviction. Her religion is not mocked. There are many, sitcom style adventures and alarms and so on, but all the way through, it affirms the place of the Christianity of Hispanics, because you can't really render Hispanic life in America without Christianity. But finally, what is the purpose of it? I believe that most people come to Christianity not through intellectual argument, but through personal experience, either a personal experience of God or a personal experience of Christians, which leads them to God. And but it's important to have the intellectual arguments to show people who are interested that there's no barrier to faith in the intellect. But the arts engage the emotions, the senses, and they are a way that people have an experience. There's something mystical about reading a novel. You really live with the characters in that novel for, the 20 hours that you read it or something, and they live in your imagination and so on. A book that I like very much, Graham Greene's The End of the Affair. It has the miraculous in it. So if you're going to believe the novel, Graham Greene's a great novelist.
Yeah.
Wonderful novel. And it's uncompromising. A miracle occurs in the second half of the book, or a couple of miracles. So you kind of, if you dismiss miracles, you have to dismiss the novel. But it also shows the power of the religious connection when the heroine becomes a believer, and then she writes a kind of a diary, a dialogue with God. It's immensely powerful. And Green himself, of course, was a convert to Christianity, to active Christianity.
Yes.
And then my final reflection, this book, Gilead, which I think is the best Christian novel of the 21st century.
It's a wonderful novel. Yeah.
It really is. And when you tell people what it is, you say, this is a 77-year-old congregational minister in the mid-1950s reflecting on his extremely uneventful life as he is about to die. And you couldn't set up something less likely to be interesting than that.
True. Yeah.
But I have recommended that novel to a lot of atheist friends, and without exception, they've come back saying, this was profoundly moving. This was a revelation.
Yes.
And Marilyn Robinson achieves a lot of things in that novel which are astounding. But so he's about to die, or he's going to die soon, and he's contemplating what heaven will be like. You hardly ever hear about heaven in Christian thinking and teaching. You almost never hear about hell either. The four last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell, even Christians never talk of them anymore.
Yep.
So here is a commercially successful novel which won the Pulitzer Prize, giving us tens of pages of contemplation about what heaven will be like and how heaven will relate to earth and so on.
Yes.
But it's an incomparably beautiful novel. You can't fail to be won by it. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people had come to Christianity through that novel. I'd be astonished if not at least one had come.
Yep.
And if one person comes to Christianity through a work of art, well, then that's fantastic. That justifies the work of art 1,000 times over.
Yeah, yeah. But I think how I would put I think what you've uncovered is the importance of the imagination in people understanding Christianity, or at least grappling with the faith. And that's something that novelists achieve, like Marilyn Robinson. Great. I've read two Graham Greene novels recently, The Power and the Glory and Brighton Rock, and both confront head on the impact of the Roman Catholic faith on their characters. And there's something so, I think they address themes, like you've said, we don't talk about the four last things, but novels can do it in a way which is almost more confronting, but at one point less confronting as well. There's something, you wouldn't hear it from the pulpit, but it works in a novel somehow. So I think you've really, you really touched on something important there.
I'm glad you read those novels. Brighton Rock, I think, is one of the most truly terrifying novels that I've ever read. Yeah. And the character, I think his name is Pinky, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Pinky. Although there is a tortured depth of humanity in him, he is one of the most terribly evil characters. Yeah. So Green had this extraordinary capacity to create wickedness in a character, not in the slapstick way, but then he does have this capacity to create hope as well. That's why I chose The End of the Affair as the novel that I focused on, because he could be a bit bleak, honestly, Graham Greene. He often doesn't end, in the ending of Brighton Rock, don't read it if you're already depressed. It's the ending of it is terrible. Right. Whereas the ending of The End of the Affair, it's very heartwarming. The guy doesn't win the girl. I'm spoiling the plot, but the girl dies. Sure. But there's a reconciliation between the lover and the jilted husband that is all too believable, and it's quite heartwarming. The other novelist I love so much, Willa Cather, began life as a Baptist, but in her maturity was an Episcopalian. Yeah. Her novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop. I mean, all of her novels are beautiful, but Death Comes for the Archbishop, I think, is one of the great novels of the 20th century. And it's not really a novel, it's an extended act of prayer. Right. But it's absolutely gripping all the way through. You can't put it down. The two priests that she's writing about are very believable, and they have their failings and shortcomings and doubts and problems as well.
Yeah.
But there's something luminous about Willa Cather's writing that, and of course, you hardly ever hear of these novelists now. Marilyn Robinson you hear about, but one object of that chapter was to alert people, say, look, if you'd like to read something, which does, as you say, you're absolutely right, Simon. Novelists engage the imagination in a way that other writers can't. And just to let people know, there's this great Christian inheritance in literature, in mainstream secular literature. None of these people was a professional Christian. You know, they weren't a clergyman or something, or an academic. Nothing wrong with clergymen or academics, but they were secular, successful novelists.
Yes, that's right.
So I hope it's a small service to people as well to alert them that this material is there. And I think too, Christianity making a tiny, tiny comeback in some films where just to present the characters honestly, you have to present their Christianity, and that's great. So here's another lesson to Christians: lead such fabulous lives that people want to make movies about them, and then they're going to have to deal with your Christianity as well.
That's good. I like that. Maybe someone will make a movie about you, Greg. I don't know. We'll see.
No. Fails on all respects.
Sure. Probably the chapter that people will be most interested in, I suspect, is the one where you discuss the faith of a range of current and former public figures. So the former leader of the opposition, Bill Hayden. These are all Australians. The former Governor General, Peter Cosgrove, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson are all featured. However, the part that will probably get everyone talking the most is the section on Scott Morrison, the current Australian Prime Minister. Could you tell us more about the Prime Minister's faith and how he understands? Because this is a point of controversy, right? Recently, this came up as a big controversy for the Prime Minister when he went to the Australian Christian Churches Conference down on the Gold Coast. Down for me, up for you, the Gold Coast. And people got very edgy about the mix between his faith and his politics. How does the Prime Minister see those two things mixing? What insights did you get from writing about the Prime Minister's faith in that regard?
Well, I'm very impressed by the way the Prime Minister handles his faith. I've got no doubt at all about its sincerity.
Yeah.
So this book isn't a left versus right book. It's not a culture wars book. It doesn't take any position between Liberal versus Labor, anything like that. And because I've written about religion spasmodically for my whole 40 years in journalism, but only a lot in the last few years, but here and there for 40 years, politicians have often spoken to me a little bit about their religious views or their religious experience. I've never been any use to them because I've always been so cagey. You know, I like a real journalist, I'm wanting them to give me secrets. I don't want to reach out a hand of friendship to them or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I've known Scott Morrison for quite a long time, and I would certainly say that his religious faith is the centre of his life. There's no doubt about that. I think so. Without judging whether he's a good or bad Prime Minister, I think he's a good Prime Minister. I think all of our politicians are pretty good people. They work hard. And the ones I know who are Christians, there's not one of them I think uses their Christianity in a base way or tries to exploit it. In fact, they're mostly very shy about it. Yeah. That's partly because the culture has browbeaten them, partly because they're aware of their own fallibility, and very much like me, they don't want Christianity to be judged by their own rackety lives, you know.
Yeah.
But Scott Morrison, I think, so he's a bit unusual because he's the first Pentecostal Christian to lead an OECD nation.
Yep.
He wasn't brought up as a Pentecostal. He was brought up in a Presbyterian church, which became a uniting church. He and his wife, Jenny, had both, by coincidence, attended the same Billy Graham rally. And oddly enough, I was there too, way back in 1979.
Oh, right.
After they married, they started going a bit more to charismatic churches. And when they lived in New Zealand for a while, they were involved in a charismatic church. But I think, so the faith is the centre of his life, as is his family. He prays every day. He's very serious about it. He knows his Bible very well. But he's also a very successful contemporary secular politician. Now, he's taken the view that he's open about his religion.
Yes.
But he doesn't go out of his way to talk about it. It's very often mocked and attacked in the most unreasonable way. But on the other hand, the attacks are so patently unfair that I think, if anything, they rebound to his advantage. But he's also wise enough to know he's not going to make, he's not going to try to claim martyrdom for himself or anything like that. He gets a huge mail from Australian Christians all the time, sending him words of encouragement and so on. People who are not Christians are generally very accepting. And of course, we live in a part of the world, Asia, which is full of religious belief.
Yes.
You know, the sort of bargain basement, silly atheism that we're drifting into is very eccentric and weird by the standards of our region. It might be quite normal in London or New York. It's very bizarre in Jakarta or Manila or Bangkok or in the South Pacific, where there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of Pentecostals, just like Scott Morrison. So that's a point of connection for him with other readers. You know, the idea you could go to an Indonesian book festival and not see the mention of Islam, it's utterly inconceivable, you know. And the other thing I'd say about Scott Morrison, and some Christians don't quite agree with him or with me when I report this and when I say I agree with it, he is of the view that the Bible is not a policy handbook. So there are plain areas where Christianity has a clear view which you could not possibly contradict as a politician and claim to be a Christian. You cannot, you know, approve the killing of innocent human beings. You cannot promote racial hatred or indeed any hatred. You have to respect human dignity. These are things on which Christianity is absolutely clear. But Christianity doesn't really tell you, the Bible doesn't tell you, should you deregulate the industrial relations system? How should you run fiscal policy? And those Christian politicians in America who sort of say, you know, we've got to cut the tax rate because this is the teaching of Jesus. Well, I think that's just silly. And
I agree.
It's silly to say it, you know, and not many people do really say that. And in Australia, it's almost unheard of.
Yes.
But Scott Morrison certainly doesn't think that God tells him to, you know, promote this bit of legislation. But at the same time, he looks all the time to his Christian faith for inspiration. So when he was on the hustings and he was feeling down and a bit depressed and a bit lacking of energy, saw the painting of an eagle, and it recalled to him a verse from the Old Testament: you will soar like an eagle and you will run and your limbs will not grow weary. And this became controversial when he said this at the Australian Christian Churches conference. But he wasn't saying, I am the eagle of God swooping on man, you know, to deliver you good. What he was saying was, I found encouragement in that verse. And he would be the first to say that Labor politicians who are Christian might find the similar encouragement in a similar verse. So in terms of Christianity, he was very open with me. There was no question that he didn't answer. I asked him how he prayed, what he thought about the afterlife. Was he going to meet his dead father and mother again? And he was very straightforward and direct, didn't hedge anything. And we had, you know, one really long conversation and a number of things that we followed up. I think he handles it. I think he handles it very well.
But it strikes me that he's consistent in his rejection of the idea that there's a mix, but that there's an inherent connection between faith and policy. So I think what you've suggested in the book is that it deeply impacts him as an individual and motivates him to serve in his role, but it doesn't actually define his policies per se. But I think that it seems like the media and maybe his detractors jump to that conclusion straight away, and they say, "Oh, look, he's saying he's a Christian, and therefore all of his policy positions are Christian positions." And you're suggesting there's not a connection in his mind, at least, between those things. I mean, what do you think the connection between faith and policy is? Is there one?
There is, but it's both deeper and less specific. So why do we believe in human rights? So one thing you want to do as a policy practitioner is observe human rights, promote human dignity. Now, Christianity is a universal faith. It's available to everyone, and a majority of Christians in the world today are not Westerners. But it is also the historical case that Western civilization grew up as the child of the Jewish and Christian traditions, or the Christian tradition with its inheritance of Judaism and so on as well. I think it's reasonable to talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the search for decency, which Western civilization has. Western civilization done a lot of bad things as well, and Christian done a lot of bad things, no doubt about that. But the things which are positive, this is great Oxford scholar Larry Siddentop in his wonderful book in The Individual, argues that great book,
Yep.
tremendous, the best book of history I've ever read.
Yep.
And he argues that everything we like in modern liberalism was thought through by the end of the Middle Ages and emerges organically out of Christianity. So human dignity, which is a core Western idea, emerges from the idea that every human being has an immortal relationship with God, that every human being is made in the likeness of God. So Christianity, I think, undergirds all the ethical dynamics and normative aspirations that good politicians have, even if they don't do it, even if they're non-Christian, they're still using Christian categories. But as I say, I don't think it adjudicates normal centre-left versus centre-right policies. So you might say, certainly there's an imperative in Christianity to help the poor. I think if you're indifferent to the poor, it's hard to square that with Christianity. But how do you help the poor? So a centre-left politician might say, let's give them more welfare. That's a reasonable thing to say. The centre-right politician might say, let's deregulate the industrial relations system a bit so that you get more people into the formal economy. And at entry level, more people get jobs, and that gives them the dignity of labour. It gives them an income, and that's a way to help the poor. Well, both of those positions, they're contradictory, but they're perfectly open to a faithful Christian. It would be quite wrong for the proponent of either of those positions to say, if you disagree with me, you're a bad Christian. You know? So the influence of Christianity on public policy is pervasive. It does have some specific things that it says, absolutely, the life issues and so on. But it doesn't, as I say, I don't think, a lot of politics is kind of trivial. How do you run the post office? Well, that is an important question, but it doesn't go to the core of your being or anything. I would hate the business of politics to be at the core of my being. Nonetheless, I recognise that politics is important.
It's very good. One of the things, the books you mentioned there, Larry Siedentop book, it's a fascinating argument in that it as you said, it's like he basically cuts the pro-enlightenment argument off at the knees, and he says actually it's all set up before the Reformation. All of the bits of liberalism are there, and as you said, then they work themselves out organically after the Reformation. But people miss this argument these days. But they don't understand our history. And one thing you return to a number of times across the book is this decline of Christianity in the West, but also a discarding of our Western heritage, which I think Siedentop's book kind of uncovers. I think because it pushes back against many of our assumptions. What do you think the future of the West is, and the future of Christianity in the West? I mean, you're not a prophet or the son of a prophet, I presume, but do you have a read on where we're headed? I mean, you've been a commentator on the importance of Western civilization and the education system and so on, and that's something that we're interested in here at the Millis Institute and at Christian Heritage College. What's your view on that big question about the position or the future of the West and of Christianity?
Well, Simon, let me start before answering your question properly to say what you're doing is exactly what should be done. Mm-hmm. So the energy and rebirth and green shoots of Christianity are in things like your college and so on. So there is an ambient background decline in Christianity in the West, but at the same time, there are tremendous green shoots, tremendous new movements, and that's a tremendous sign of hope. But where is Western civilization going? So defining the West as Western Europe, North America, and Australia and New Zealand, it is becoming substantially more atheist as the years go by. And the older cohorts of people are very faithful believers. Each younger cohort has less believers or fewer believers than the cohort above it. Oh, I think you can possibly see a turning. I think you could possibly discern the beginnings of a turning. It is, of course, extremely eccentric position that the West is in, because religion is on fire in the rest of the world. It's the social force that the Chinese Communist Party can't contain is Christianity. Christianity is on fire in Africa. Christians are persecuted. They're the most persecuted religion in the world, but they're faithful even unto death in Pakistan and, many other parts of Asia and Africa and so on. But for the West, Now, in one sense, the portents are gloomy enough because, the West is going mad in its ideology. I think all this crazy identity politics, that's what happens to liberalism when you cut it off from its underlying Christian roots. It just goes crazy. And it's looking for absolutes in politics. This is where I say politics is very ugly if you regard it as the
core of your being.
If the glory of being is concerned with politics, that's very, very ugly. And also, if you take Christianity out of politics, it's very ugly. My favorite newspaper columnist, Ross Douthat, in the New York Times, has a great line that says, if you didn't like the Christian right, wait till you meet the post-Christian right. And, the left are mad to think that they're going to win forever. They'll win for a while. And then the people who will end up opposing them will not be those well-mannered, good, kindly, generous Christian conservatives that they so despise. They will be marauding, nationalistic, tribalistic people filled with hostility and resentment. Where is the West going? You can see good signs and an overall level of decline. One of the people I interview in the book is Nicky Gumbel, who's the great progenitor of the Alpha course, the Vicar of Holy Trinity Brompton in London. And he gave me a stunning vignette, and other Christian leaders have given me similar images. In 1750, I think it was 16 people attended the Easter service in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. 16 people. There were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets of London. But then along came the Wesleys, the Methodist revival, Wilberforce, and there was a tremendous rebirth of Christianity throughout Britain. And very often in a moment like this, the Christian church, defining that most broadly, has bounced back, has rebounded brilliantly. There's a wonderful line of Wesley's, I get to misremember the quote, but it's something like, if you set yourself on fire with enthusiasm, people will come from miles to watch you burn, know. And of course, we have the assurance in the gospel where Jesus says, the gates of hell will never prevail against you. So that's not a recipe for complacency. That's a recipe for us all to be as active as we can in our own way. And one thing I want to do with these books is encourage all Christians to own their faith publicly, not necessarily to, spruik on every street corner. I mean, everybody has their own method, their own call, but I do think all Christians should own their faith publicly because it encourages other Christians, and it's a signpost to people who don't yet have the truth. It's very hard to predict how the West will go. I would say I don't think the West can be the West unless it recovers belief in Christianity, because we are competing with societies which have much cruder but much more vigorous belief systems. Chinese nationalism, Russian nationalism, Islamism in a lot of societies. And I don't think our guilt-ridden, angst-ridden, confused, febrile, neurotic, crazy caricature of liberalism is enough to sustain the leading global civilization. So there are conservative friends or people, that I've done seminars with and so on, Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, even perhaps Tom Holland, who appreciate everything Christianity offers to Western civilization, but don't want to quite make the final leap themselves of proclaiming Christianity, and would like to hold the view that you can have Christian values without Christian belief. Now, I'm not remotely judging any of those men as individuals, but I think in the end, that's not a sustainable position, especially for young people. You can't say to young people in their teens and 20s, I want you to hold all these social norms, even though they are based on beliefs which I think are superstitious, meaningless, fraudulent, fake. Their response will either be, I'd rather go to the beach, or they will seek out something much more intense. They'll seek out an intense experience of belief somewhere else. So I do think the future of the West, even if Christianity is not a policy handbook, the future of the West is tied to a rebirth of Christianity. Final thought, Peter Cosgrove, who's a wonderfully ebullient guy. I spoke to him not about being Governor General or Chief of the Defence Force, but about being a believer in war. He saw a lot of action in Vietnam. He was a platoon commander in a platoon commander's war. And I asked him about what it was like to look on the bodies of the dead that you and your soldiers have killed, to pray in the time of battle, to be a religious believer in war. And he's a terrifically ebullient fellow. And he didn't give me an intellectual reason, but he said he was certain that there would be a revival of Christianity. He was filled with optimism.
Right.
And I think his optimism may be beyond reason, but I don't think it's unreasonable.
Well, it's a good optimistic note for us to finish on. I've really enjoyed the chat, Greg. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Simon. A great pleasure to talk to you.
The book, here it is again. The book is Christians, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. It's available if you're allowed to go to the bookstore in your state. It's available in a bookstore. Otherwise, of course, you can always order it online. It's a great read. And thank you for joining us on the Millis podcast.